We do have a ton to get through in this episode.
Common sense is finally prevailing.
There was controversy this month, Dave.
I'm not particularly excited by that.
Secrets and things on set.
I haven't told them anything.
I think this is just good times all round.
Every Doctor Who is liked by somebody, and that's a really good thing.
Davo, my doctor.
I know we disagree on this one.
First world problems, Dave.
I get why fans are asking those questions.
Oh gosh, that's actually quite a lot to talk about.
It doesn't compute.
It's the elephant in the room.
That's okay.
Fandom versus the BBC.
The cardinal sin.
Moving along.
Lunch. Hello, I'm Dave.
And I'm Rob.
And welcome to the Doctor Who show for September 2024. Rob, how are you?
Dave, I'm excited. It's that time of year. We've got football's finals. One this weekend and one next weekend.
It is September in Australia. It is a glorious time. It's the start of spring. It's the footy finals. One of my favourite players, the captain of the mighty Carlton Football Club, just won the Brownlow Medal for the second time and broke the record for the most votes. So huge results for me. Sydney are in the grand final, Rob.
Yes, very happy about that. Something I picked very early in the season, Dave.
You did. It's an exciting time to be alive here in Australia. And I'm glad that listeners, you're all joining us, because we are doing a deep dive into an individual story. We put this up for a vote at the end of last episode. A Town Called Mercy got 11.6%.
Yes.
The Husbands of Riversong was leading briefly and ended with 24%.
Yeah.
Face of Evil was leading for a long time and ended with 28.9%. But with 35.5%, The Crusade, I would suggest a not often talked about story, is going to be our topic this month.
Yes, although it was funny that another couple of podcasts did actually put out a Crusade episode in the past month, including our friends over at the Big Blue Blocks podcast, but completely out of our hands. It was a vote of the people, and that's what you people want, so that's what we're going to deliver tonight.
It absolutely was. So look, I'm looking forward to that. A few bits and pieces to do before we get there. Let's start though, Rob, with a review from Apple Podcasts.
Sure. I've got one here from Saucy Jack via Apple Podcasts. He's in Ireland, and this comes from the 9th of September. The heading is A Must Listen for Doctor Who Fans, 5 stars. Well-informed, frank and genuine discussion of Doctor Who, and always funny. Presented by a couple of very engaging Aussie hosts, the show treats the current and classic iterations of Doctor Who, as well as a range of related book, film, and recently historic stage show topics. Rob and Dave are very enthusiastic about Doctor Who, well-versed in the stories, their production, fandom and its foibles, and it's always underpinned by a genuine affection for the show. This is one of the very best Doctor Who podcasts. I look forward to every episode. Well, thank you, Saucy Jack.
Thank you very much. I hope everything is well over in Ireland. Lovely, lovely country. Of course, if you enjoy our show, there's plenty out there. Our list makers came out for this month just a couple of weeks ago. We've got a Gin and TARDIS on the Gunfighters coming in the next couple of weeks. So lots to listen to. Before we get into it though, Rob, just a couple of little minor things. First of all, look, a sad note. I want to make mention to a friend of many of us down here in Doctor Who fandom in Melbourne, Craig Blythe, who very sadly passed away earlier this month. Only about 60, so far too early. Craig has been a big part of fandom down here, not just Doctor Who fandom, but all different kinds of tele-fantasy fandom. Back in the multiverse days in the 1990s, he was a big part of that. He was a good guy. He was one of those guys that when he came into the club meeting or the fan event, you knew you were going to have a good time. You knew it would be a good conversation. You knew he'd be fun to hang out with. He used to volunteer to do the overnight security at our conventions in lieu of a free ticket. So he would stay up all night and make sure nobody swiped the VCR or was trying to sleep in the video room or anything like that. That's how he got his free tickets. But look, just a good guy. When the news went around that he was unwell and going into palliative care down here, so many people just stopped and said, "Oh my God, that's really sad." And a lot of people went to visit him in his last week alive. A lot of people got down to his funeral. Sadly, I was in Canberra, so I wasn't able to. But look, a really good guy, a really fun guy, gone far too young. And look, the least I can do is give him a shout out on the podcast and say you'll be missed by many, many fans.
Oh, I'm very sorry to hear that. Wale to Craig.
Thank you very much. I also just wanted to mention as well that a number of people have mentioned to me they didn't know that some of us had a Goodies podcast. That is the Goodies Pirate podcast. It is all over. We have done the whole series, but it does exist out there. So if you're a fan of the Goodies, please do go check that out. Please remember that when myself and Richard and Rob and Mark started doing this, and then Tom later on, we were very new to the podcasting thing, and it's I'm very happy with the content, but not always very happy with some of the production on those early episodes. So bear with us. But if you are curious, the Goodies Pirate podcast, please check us out.
Yeah, absolutely. I listened to every episode of that.
You absolutely did. We'll crack on into the news because we've got a few things to talk about this month.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I just want to talk about a Hollywood Reporter article that discussed a whole lot of things that former showrunner Stephen Moffat said at the 2024 Toronto International Film Festival. Now, nothing sort of particularly out there or blown away, but a few nice comments. For example, "You think that it's cheesy old BBC adventure series," he said. "Actually, it is the single smartest television format ever devised. By that I mean you can sack anyone. If anyone pisses you off, you can just get rid of them and regenerate a new Doctor played by a new star." Moffat also said things like, "The American system works brilliantly. There's no question about that. It does amazing, amazing television," Moffat said. "I've never fitted that comfortably into it, though." So that just sort of gives you a sample, I think, of this really frank and honest discussion that Moffat had about his process, where he's been in his career, what he's doing. And if you're interested, go search Hollywood Reporter, Stephen Moffat interview. I like seeing Moffat this distance from the show now and very relaxed and able to look back at his time and look back at his career and go, you know what, I tried to do this stuff in America and it didn't work, and I did this stuff in the UK and it did work, and now I'm doing this. And it was just it was a long, frank interview that I think he was doing in front of an audience at a film festival. He knew he was with a friendly crowd. He opened up, and I just think it was well worth a read.
Yeah, I've read this, and I was quite happy reading it, because he is at that stage of life where you can just start telling some truths.
Yeah, yes, that's a good way of putting it.
And it's fun.
The next story is from you, Rob.
Yeah, a quick one here, Dave, because I will actually be saying more in short topics about the Neil Gaiman situation that has caused all of this to happen. So just here noting that the production has been paused on the third season of Good Omens that had been shooting in Scotland, and of course starring David Tennant, and that's the reason we're mentioning it here. And this is a pretty big deal, because I'm hearing it might be more than just a pause, as Gaiman's fingerprints are all over the show. He's executive producer, writer, showrunner, kind of hard to tell someone filling all those roles. Don't show up on Monday, we'll take it from here. The show really is his, so I think they've been trying to work out a way through things, even if there is a way through things. Meanwhile, development of a Disney film, which is an adaptation of Gaiman's 2008 novel, The Graveyard Book, has also been put on hold because of what's going on. And again, I'll talk about it more in short topics. The only outlet limply waving the flag for Gaiman's work at the moment is Netflix, which has season 2 of The Sandman ready to go. And it's doing its best to say, hey guys, remember how much you love season 1? Yeah, we've got more coming, without actually mentioning that it's a Neil Gaiman show. Although how any fans of it would know that it's not a Neil Gaiman show is quite beyond me. It's a real mess all around, Dave, and I will talk more about it in a moment.
Yeah, I must admit, even though I actually didn't know that Neil Gaiman was involved with Good Omens, I certainly knew that he was involved with Sandman. Even I, as somebody who really isn't a Neil Gaiman fan, not as in I don't like it, but just as in, other than his couple of episodes of Babylon 5 and Doctor Who, I've just not seen any of his work. Even I knew he was involved with Sandman.
Yeah. Oh, look, and The Sandman, the first season of that on Netflix was fantastic. I commend it to anyone. Marvellous piece of telefantasy. Wonderful.
Yeah, no, it's had very good reviews. I haven't seen it myself, but yeah, I've heard good things.
Alrighty.
And finally, Rob, not so much a news item to wrap up our news segment, but the reinstatement, the reincarnation, if you like, of our semi-regular shooty gossip section that was happening over the last year or so. Look, this is one of those interesting ones, Rob, where over the course of the last few weeks, I've had multiple different people through multiple different sources and also multiple different links and the like on social media really going to hyperdrive with the rumour mill that Shooty has been sacked or is walking out or is leaving under amicable terms or some variation thereof at the end of his second series. Now, it's always kind of human when you start to hear the same story from multiple sources to start to give it credence. And there was a moment when I was sort of going, oh, maybe there is something. I messaged you and I was like, Rob, have you heard this? Like, these rumours seem to be all sort of aligning and maybe there's something in it. And then I think it was you that pointed out to me and a couple of others pointed out to me, absolutely correctly, that Disney have made it very, very clear they're not making a decision on the fate of the show until they see the numbers for the second season. It's in the can. They're going to let it broadcast. As we discussed on this show a few months ago when I talked about Kevin Smith sort of talking about the background of the numbers for getting a second season of his Masters of the Universe show, these streaming services are very, very meticulous and methodical about waiting for real data, and they can tell not just how many downloads there's been, but how many people watched all the episodes and how quickly they watched all the episodes, or if they gave up, where they gave up, all that sort of stuff. And we don't yet know what's happening there. So I think the only thing we do know is that if we're going to get a third series, it's not going to be a bang on 12 months afterwards, because there's going to be time to let the second one go out, do the assessment, decide they're going to push the button on a third one, then film it. So like most series on streaming these days, you get those big gaps between seasons because they want to see the numbers before they commission the next one. Unless you're a proper international off-the-charts success like Heartstopper, and, they would be because Dylan Reeves was the producer. Unless you're a success like that where they go, right, we're going to buy seasons 2 and 3 at the same time and film them back to back, that's incredibly rare. So I think whatever the rumours, we probably know what we don't know.
Yeah, I think it's one of these wish fulfillment type things because a lot of the online people running with this rumour are the people who'd really love for Ncuti Gatwa to leave the role. And it's always not so surprising on these channels when their rumours always seem to dovetail with what their audience would most like to see. One thing we do know for sure, Dave, is that Ncuti Gatwa was on a 2-year contract. So if Disney doesn't continue the show, then I guess he is out the door because he was only on a 2-year contract anyway. If Disney does decide to continue the series, then I guess there's a renegotiation of his contract or he will leave. So there are options. Some of them involve him maybe leaving the show. But I think I'm sitting on the side of the fence that says I think this is more wish fulfillment for some people. And I'm not sure there's anything to really hang this on.
Yeah, and interestingly, I've heard variations on the contract situation as well. I've heard that it is just simply outright a 2-year contract. I've also heard that it's 2 years with an option. So if Disney wants to activate that option, he's got nowhere to go. So, I mean, let's face it, nobody other than Ncuti and his manager and Disney actually knows Shooty's contract arrangements. So,
yes.
It just that's something that just, really highlights to me that we just don't know a lot of this stuff, and nobody who says they knows a lot of this stuff. So that's a bit of our Ncuti rumour mill for this month.
Yeah, worth mentioning because it's out there, and in fact we had a listener send us a DM on Twitter about it just recently, like, have you heard this? And I was like, yeah, I have. And I told him basically what I've said here tonight. So people are talking about it, so it was worth mentioning. Yeah,
and look, the final point I'll make is, as we all know, if you give fans a vacuum, they will fill it. So, okay, Disney and the BBC and Russell T Davies probably can't make any announcements right now, but the fact they haven't means there will be speculation, and it will only be killed off when they have facts to replace it.
Yeah, I mean, Russell's column in the latest Dwim was about him going to the proms event and getting in and out and being made to sign loads of autographs and things that had nothing to do with writing episodes of the show or looking at rushes from the show or anything to do with the show. It was very light on, and that's just all contributing to that vacuum at the moment.
Absolutely. So look, we'll move on to short topics. I've got the first, and this is Dave met Fraser Hines.
Yes, you did.
I did seen him before, and but went to the Sirens of Audio Fraser Hines event down here in Melbourne. They did a number of them. There was one in Sydney, there was one in Brisbane, and once again, a really, really fun day. Now, I want to say right at the top, thank you to those people who did come up and say they listened to the Doctor Who show and said some lovely things. It's always very weird when that happens because, I'm just this guy, doing this podcast with my mate in Sydney, and
I know.
The idea that people listen is just so crazy, but so lovely. So look, people like Chris and Troy and Aaron who did come up and say hi, thank you very much. It really was appreciated. Once again, the Sirens of Audio event was a really good event. It's fan-run, it's friendly, it's not so big that it's impersonal, but not so small that it's kind of awkward. They're really good sizes, really good events. And I've seen Fraser Hines before, but if you haven't and you wanted to hear the Knickers story and various other ones before, then the kilt story, if you hadn't heard those before, the car wash story, if you've never heard those before from Fraser, you got to hear the Fraser regular stories firsthand. But there was also some really interesting stories that he's told that I hadn't heard before. And it really struck me, Rob, listening to Fraser, just watch him on stage, I really appreciated just what a career this guy has had. He's been basically in work in the profession since he was a child actor. And look, as he put it, he's not Hollywood rich and famous, but he's always had a nice house. He's always had a nice car. He talked about the fact that when he was a kid acting one day, he came home from school and his mum said, "Oh, by the way, you've just bought us a house." So, and, he sort of said, part of him wants to go, well, shouldn't that money have been in trust for me? But, as a child actor, he was successful enough to buy his family a house. And he's just been in work ever since then. And he talked about working with Charlie Chaplin as a child actor. How amazing is that to be in a room with someone who worked with Charlie Chaplin?
Yeah, that's wild.
Working with Michael Caine when he was a young up-and-coming actor. He talked about when a mate of his was putting together this strange sort of country-based soap opera, and we've only got a contract for 12 episodes, but mate, come along and be in it, and it'll be really fun. We'll just do this 12 episodes. And then 11 years later, he was in one of the biggest shows on television, Emmerdale. Just absolutely amazing. He was able to talk about Tales of the TARDIS, which was really cool. So again, there's some new stories there. I asked him some questions about the directors he'd worked with, and again, just having him in that smaller sort of audience and environment, able to say, I liked working with these directors. I liked working with Douglas Camfield, not because of the shots he was taking or the stuff that we as fans see, but the fact that Fraser felt Camfield was a genuinely collaborative director. So if Fraser or Troughton or whatever said, hey, could we maybe do the shot this way? Or could we sort of be doing this in the background? Or could we do this? Camfield would say, yeah, I like that idea. This is how we'll make it work, and I'll adjust my camera script. And it would be a really collaborative process. In contrast to a director like Maurice Barry, who he didn't like, who was completely uncollaborative, to the point that, Rob, in Tomb of the Cybermen, where they enter the tombs for the first time, and the Doctor and Jamie go to hold Victoria's hand but hold each other's hand?
Yes.
So they worked that out in the rehearsals, but they knew if they went to Maurice Barry and said, hey, we've got this little gag to put in, what do you think? He'd go, no, you can't do that. That's not in the script. We're not doing that. So they just did it on the actual take. And the reason why they grabbed their hands sort of so far up their bodies is because they didn't know where the camera shot was going to be. Was it going to be a long shot, a mid shot, a close shot? So they've gone, well, to make sure we get in shot, we have to be up at chest level, otherwise it might not make the shot. And so just those sort of little stories were really, really interesting. So just, again, for someone I've seen before, and I've seen Fraser a couple of times. I've been to the
You've
pub
been on
with
the
him.
Source with him,
I've been quite drunk with Fraser Hines back in the day, yes. There were new stories to tell, and I think that format is just really conducive to hearing those different things. And everybody in the audience who had questions got to ask their questions.
Yeah, that's fantastic. What a good day out.
Yeah, really, really good day out. So if you are in Australia, particularly on the East Coast, Sirens of Audio are bringing Sylvester McCoy and Janet Fielding out in November. So go to Sirens of Audio's website and go ahead and book. I have no hesitation in endorsing these events.
Yeah, fantastic.
Rob, you've got some more on Mr. Gaiman for us.
Yeah, I do. I guess changing tack quite a bit now, Dave. A few months back, Tortoise Media released the podcast Master, the allegations against Neil Gaiman, which was a pretty harrowing listen, honestly, chronicling the alleged sexual assault and manipulation of several women by Neil Gaiman. And as I said to you at the time it came out, Dave, brace for impact. Gaiman's been Me Too'd. And nothing happened. The mainstream media didn't say boo. Even a lot of fan sites and places fans gather said nothing. And I thought, wow, if this was 2 or 3 years back, this would be major, because Gaiman is like king of the geek writers. He's not obscure. Why is this not getting spoken about? Even in a general... Oh, go on.
As I said, as somebody who's not really familiar with his work, I know about him.
Yeah.
He's a name.
Yeah, so why wasn't it getting spoken about, even in a general sort of sense, let alone loads of people having opinions on what was being alleged? But in more recent weeks, and certainly since we recorded our last monthly episode, the floodgates have opened. Some outlets are holding off still, but broadly it's getting traction. And I spoke earlier about Good Omens being shut down in Scotland and a movie not going ahead. And these have been the catalyst for some people finally hearing what's been bubbling along for a few months now. And as you'd imagine, people are taking sides and drawing up battle maps, and I'm not going to do that here, except to say I think the podcast was well done. It has some feedback from Gaiman in it. He didn't answer all their questions, though. Many times I'll say, we put this question to Neil Gaiman and got no reply. But it even has some Gaiman audio in it, where he's been recorded talking to some of these issues that have arisen. So hopefully no one out there will be thinking, oh, none of this happened. It's made up. From the start, it's more, yes, this has happened. How did it happen? Should it have happened, given age differences and power discrepancies? When else has it maybe happened, and so on. So it also tries to go down this Scientology path, as Gaiman's father was big into Scientology. He was a big kahuna in Scientology in the UK, and Gaiman himself was working in it as a young man. But it doesn't really get past, and he's got Scientology links. Ooh, Scientology. That's probably the least successful part of the podcast. I'm not entirely sure they needed to go there. It feels like some tacked on sensationalism. It's over-egging the pudding, right. I think, when you get to the podcast. But I do commend the podcast to anyone out there who wants to know what's going on. It's a tough listen, I'm not going to lie, but it's best that you hear things for yourself, make up your own mind. He's a very famous writer, of course. He's had a fair bit to do with Doctor Who, and that's why I'm talking about it here on our podcast. Be across why these shows are getting cancelled and why he seems to be in the process of getting cancelled himself. It's a big deal. And I'm not sure there's a path back from allegedly doing the kinds of things the podcast mentions, especially when they're things he's sort of publicly been against all his life. I might stop there, Dave.
Yeah, look, I've got nothing particular to add to that in the specific. I, as I say, don't know a lot about Neil Gaiman other than his B5 and Who works. I haven't heard the podcast. I think the one thing I will say is, I think as fans of the sort of shows and films that we're fans of, we have long kind of assumed that some of these cultural issues that have happened in the entertainment sector happen over there. They're big Hollywood, they're big Disney, they're big films, and that's where things happen with your Weinsteins and others. And I think we need to accept that our part of the entertainment world was not immune from these things, that there was some awful stuff that happened. And we've said before, some of the stories we've heard, even just about the production of classic Doctor Who, we sort of sit there and go, oh, what jolly japes they got up to back in the day. And sometimes we sit there and go, ooh, no, that wasn't a jolly jape. That was a bit icky, actually. Or that was a bit, workplace bullying-ish, actually. And, look, the times were the times. I'm not going to, go back and retrospectively cancel anyone, but I just think we are all appreciating that our little corner of the universe was not immune from these cultural problems.
No.
And that's going to come out here and there, and that's very sad, but I'm a big believer that sunlight is the best disinfectant, and if this public, I want to say public shaming, it's more nuanced than that, but this public identification of these problems does lead to cultural change and makes things better, that's a good thing.
Yeah, even going back 20 years, to when I was a younger man, you'd hear rumours about what people got up to, what at conventions and things, and you look back on it now and you think, yeah, that's a real abuse of power in some ways, but it's kind of always been like that, with rock stars and as well.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh gosh, you can open a real can of worms when someone turns around and realizes that they weren't actually loved by the object of their affection, and they were just maybe used. And in this day and age, sometimes people do something about it.
No, that's fair enough. Very heavy, but I think I think you're right to raise it, Rob. So reasonable enough. Changing tone back to the more positive.
Yes.
My second and final short topic for this month is to say that I have reread the Virgin New Adventure Happy Endings. I read it on a beach in Fiji, in fact, since we last recorded, which was very nice. And I am once again so pleased that I took the time to reread this one. And several people encouraged me to do it. And not even close friends, like people, just listeners, people that I talked to on Twitter said, no, give it another chance, have another read, because my approach to this one was so different. So I would have first read this when I was 15, nearly 16, I think. Mm-hmm. And at that stage, as people know, the Virgin New Adventures and the Missing Adventures were my era of Doctor Who. They were the new stories that came out, and it was very exciting, but that didn't mean I loved them all. And it didn't mean that I didn't have cynical fan views on the range at times. and one of my cynical fan views was that the range was just a little bit too incestuous at times. And that these authors would all sort of go down the pub together and swap stories and have their own little in-jokes and all the rest of that. And I didn't like that. It wasn't a good thing to do. And certainly at 15, I didn't get it. And at 15, I also...
Can I jump in and ask, was that... because you were young if you were 15, was it a sense of jealousy that you weren't part of their gang, making up what was new Doctor Who at that time?
I think that was
something else.
Yeah, I think that was definitely a part of it. I don't think it was all of it. I think I didn't particularly gel with the way it worked its way into the books either. But yeah, that was absolutely part of it. That, like, I somewhere over at a pub in London there with a cool kids club, and we were just these other guys down in Melbourne. It was definitely a part of it. But also at 15, I certainly had no interest in reading a meandering novel about a wedding that has lots of scenes of, taking the alien bridesmaids to get their dresses made, and will they, won't they, and will the groom sleep with the bridesmaid, and all that sort of stuff. At 15, I couldn't give a toss about that. And so this novel was not for me. But 30-odd years later, I can enjoy the celebration of this being the 50th book and doing that really referential sort of stuff, and actually feeling like, hey, we've created a universe here, 50 books, after the show has been cancelled and written off and no sign of it, coming back in a serious way other than this failed telly movie. Celebrating that achievement was really cool, and I did enjoy and I did appreciate it. But also, again, just being older, a bit more mature, I did appreciate the fact that there really was no plot. Other than about 2 chapters where the Master pops up for no apparent reason, there was just no plot. It's just this long, rambling sort of story about collecting all these wedding guests to have this wedding, and will they, won't they, and some nerves, and lots of guests from the past. And it's whimsical, and it's lovely, and it's fun, and it's everything 15-year-old me would have hated, and I can now appreciate it. And just, of all the books I've changed my view on, this has probably got to be the biggest, because it's so fundamentally different at my age than it was as a kid.
I own a copy. I've never read it. It sounds like an episode of Neighbours.
I would say it's a bit more Emmerdale than Neighbours.
Okay.
Because there's a little bit more sort of, English countryside and a bit more of a slower pace and everything. Everybody just being really lovely and twee to each other, which is, it is what it is. And I,
right.
I would never want... I was going to say I don't want all my Doctor Who to be like that. I don't want any other Doctor Who to be like that. But just this once, saying goodbye to Bernice Summerfield in the 50th anniversary, I got it. As I say, it was probably helped by the fact that I was reading it on holiday in Fiji.
Yes. Were you having a pina colada at the time, Dave?
No, probably a very nice glass of white. But yeah, no, just a fun read, and I'm very happy I did it.
Oh, very good. Very good stuff.
And a final short topic from you.
Yeah, this final one might seem odd, but we do talk Star Wars from time to time on our Alternate Galaxies shows. And indeed, the precursor to this podcast was the Who Wars podcast, which was literally half Doctor Who, half Star Wars.
Seems so long ago now.
Yeah, Star Wars is never far away from my thoughts, Dave. And I note for newer listeners that Who Wars began in September. of 2014. So a decade ago now, and it ended in January of 2016. And it ended because I thought Star Wars fandom was getting weird and out of control, and I didn't want to be part of the day-to-day, week-to-week discussion about it. Doing the odd alternate galaxies here is fine, Dave, but being part of the day-to-day cut and thrust of Star Wars, no thanks. And so this was an opinion I was forming in 2015-ish, so almost a decade ago now. And when I look at things that have been happening in fandom lately, like some YouTube shows trying to get other Star Wars YouTube shows deplatformed or at best demonetized simply because they don't agree with that show's worldview. I'm like, oh, whoa, hang on. And I've said this on Twitter. It reminds me of a great Game of Thrones quote, which is, quote, "When you tear out a man's tongue, you are not proving him a liar. You're only telling the world that you fear what he might say." End quote. And I'm just so glad, Dave, that I backed Doctor Who over Star Wars back then, because while Doctor Who fandom has its morons here and there, it has its bitchy fans here and there, and it has people who support questionable topics, and obviously we all don't agree on the same stuff, I think you can pretty easily find your Doctor Who tribe and exist within that tribe without other tribes actively trying to end you, Under Disney, I think the temperature in Doctor Who land has maybe gone up a little. I'll acknowledge that. But I think broadly the fandom has navigated this past decade way better than the Star Wars fandom. And I just wanted to note that here tonight.
I think that's very fair, very accurate. And when I occasionally sort of wade off into Star Wars fandom because there's a new Star Wars show or something I'm after, or indeed Star Trek fandom, my God, is it terrifying out there.
Yeah.
You just sort of very quickly, no, I'm not waiting any further. I'm just going back to nice Doctor Who fandom, thank you.
Yeah, even guys I would watch on YouTube or listen to, 2-3 years ago are increasingly having very polarized views because it seems to be the only way they get cut through. You're on one side or the other.
Yeah.
And the nuance is gone, and just the nice content they used to make is largely gone. And it's like, oh man, I sensed this was happening a decade ago and I got out then. It's even worse now.
No, very fair. I think sometimes we don't appreciate just how nice we have it sometimes in Doctor Who fandom.
We do.
Speaking of Doctor Who,
yes,
it's time for our main topic. Rob, yes. I'm very, very excited. I was genuinely surprised when the Crusade won the poll. I thought it's this Hartnell story, it's half missing. I was even hesitant to even nominate it because I thought, no one's going to want to listen to a podcast about a half missing story from 1966. What am I thinking? And it won, and I'm really excited because it's a story that I don't think talk about nearly as much. It's not the Aztecs, it's not Marco Polo, it's not the Romans. It's this sort of little rarely discussed thing. And even when I was watching on the Blu-ray, the extras have the linking narrations from not only William Russell doing the DVD release, but they have Sylvester McCoy doing the Hartnell years release way back in the mid-90s. And I watch those and go, the guys writing this didn't even know what this story was about. They're just like, oh yeah, the Doctor went to the Crusades and Saladin or something. Yeah, roll the tape. It's just it's just this really underappreciated story. So I'm really happy to talk about this. I'm really glad that we've got the Blu-ray now to watch it on. The cleanup job on that, look, it's not perfect, but it's just really, really good. We get to listen to the audio. We'll talk more about the reconstructions later on. But I was really excited, Rob. How about you?
Yeah, I was trying to figure out whether people out there were voting for this to punish us, like, we'll make them watch the black and white that only half exists, or whether they were genuinely interested in, my God, I've never heard a podcast talk about that. As I said, I think another couple of podcasts did it this past month, so, when you're waiting for a bus, 2 or 3 turn up at once.
Yeah.
Or maybe it was a combination of those two things. I don't know. But thank you for voting for it, whatever your intentions were, because this was a lot of fun to do.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Rob, when did you first encounter this story?
Dave, I have no memory of seeing these episodes until the Lost in Time DVD came out.
Yeah.
And prior to that, I hadn't even listened to any audio recordings. I know you were big into audio recordings when you were a kid. but I had read the Target novel, and my experience of that wasn't great because it's one of the very early ones. It's about the third published, I think.
Yeah, it's in that first three with the Zabi and An Exciting Adventure with the Daleks.
Yeah. And when you're a young kid, like I was, who's grown up with Uncle Terence's 120-page pot boilers, to go to something written in the 60s, trying to be a bit more, I don't know if literary is the right word, but it was certainly from another time. and it had a doctor in it that I hadn't warmed to at that point. I would soon warm to him because heaps of Targets started coming out with Hartnell in the 80s, but I hadn't warmed to Hartnell. And it was a period of history I had no feel for because it wasn't really taught in Australian schools. All of that combined meant that this was a story that I had little interest in or background as a kid. Of course, I would then see the episodes that exist on that DVD. I understand the history so much more now. I have a greater appreciation of Hartnell and all those things, which point a big neon sign at it now saying, it's one of the good ones. But initially, in the 80s, no, I wasn't taken in by this at all.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that because my experience also was one of it being a much less known story. You're right. My first experience was the Target novel, and it is one of those Whittaker ones that is not overwritten, as you say, but it is certainly pitched higher than the average Target novel would become. And Whittaker does take license with the story as well, and it's a little bit more adult as well in just the sort of the story that he's telling. So it wasn't one where you read the Target novel and go, great, I understand that story, I've got that story in my mind. I just sort of remember that there was Ian pegged down about to be eaten by ants and something about climbing a balcony. Like that's all I really remembered from it. So that was really good. I think the first time I would have seen it would have been when I bought a second-hand copy of the Hartnell Years tape in 1997. And I don't have much memory of watching it at the time. I suspect the picture quality on that wouldn't have been great. And the linking narrations were about a sentence, let's be honest.
Yeah.
And then I think when they did the big release after finding the lion, was a big deal. I can remember that set coming out and everybody wanted to get a copy to see the new episode. And one fond memory I have is that we'd all, just before the local Doctor Who Club Christmas party, all got our copies of The Lion and Part 3, Wheel of Fortune, in the post, and all sort of watched it. And obviously, one of our friends, Mad Dog Morgan, had taken Hartnell's intro in that to heart because as a few of us were coming down the path towards the venue, he, like Hartnell at the start of it, jumped out of the bushes, pointed at us and went, "Good afternoon!"
Good afternoon!
And that has been a greeting amongst a certain group of friends of ours for the last 20-something years now. Every so often, we'll just see someone across the car park, "Good afternoon!"
Good afternoon!
Like Hartnell in the Crusade. So, very fond memories, but it's not one I've watched regularly. I've seen it a couple of times on the Lost in Time discs, as you said, but it's not a story where I know every beat and every line off by heart.
Yeah, and look, you just mentioned the find of the Lion episode there, and I do want to quickly mention, I've jotted it down, he messaged me on Facebook earlier today. Paul Scoons,
yes.
super fan from New Zealand,
yes,
was part of that find of the Lion, and he discussed his part in finding that episode on our January 29th, 2017 episode. That's the first episode of our second year of the podcast. He's actually my co-host, Dave. You must have been on holidays or something.
Sounds like me.
And yes, and it may still be on the podcast feed, or it might need to be streamed from our website because episodes do drop off our podcast feed the more we add to it. So look that up if you want to hear Paul talk about his part in finding the Lion.
Yeah, absolutely. It's quite an epic little story, and yeah, well done for finding that missing episode. So, Rob, what struck me as I put this on is that this is Doctor Who really as it was originally conceived, because you've got David Whittaker writing it, the original script editor, who did a lot to really set up the characters and the plot and the tone of the story. And so we have got that very Hartnell-esque pure historical, which has a couple of hallmarks. The first is the crew arrive, they just inveigled into history, and then it's just about escaping. There's no sense of we've got to do this, we've got to do that, or we've got to fix this. It's just, can we survive history and get away? And it's written like a Shakespeare play.
Yeah, and one of the first things you notice about the Hartnell historicals, I guess in general, is that the historical understanding of the audience is expected to be quite high.
I had that note, so keep going.
Okay, then. Characters are rolled on, situations happen, and you're meant to know what's happening. Even Vicky, from five centuries on from the audience's time, and well over 10 centuries on from the actual history she's involved in, immediately hits on them being in the Holy Land, which feels really odd when she says it, but I guess as the audience identification character, she knows this stuff because the audience would know this stuff. And I do wonder if it would be the same today. I don't think I could see Ruby Sunday knowing all about the Crusades if Shooty took her there, and it feeling entirely natural for her character to come out with.
No, I had exactly the same note. And as you said earlier, Rob, it wasn't something that was taught in schools in Australia when we grew up, but I think it absolutely would have been a classic part of English curriculums back in the 1960s. Yes. And you do notice that lack of exposition. And I was just thinking about it as you were, that if this was done today, there will be that moment where the Doctor turns to the companion and says, of course, as you know, Jaffa is now part of Israel, and this is where Richard the Lionheart, da-da-da-da. There were those scenes, and even to the detail that they don't explain who Richard the First was, they don't feel the need to explain who Saladin was, they don't feel the need to explain Coeur de Lion. That's just a phrase that everyone goes, oh, Coeur de Lion, that was Richard the Lionheart, of course. But there are moments when they do, and I think that shows the level that it had to get to before they did it. For example, Malagrick, they do feel the need to explain, because a schoolboy or girl probably wouldn't know that. The bit at the end where Vicky turns to the Doctor and effectively the audience and says, Doctor, will he ever see Jerusalem? And the Doctor then gives a couple of sentence history of what happens to King Richard at the end of the Crusade before he goes home. So the moment there were moments there that were, okay, we need to explain this bit to the audience. But the level of education required is very, very different, and the way they treat the audience is very, very different. And like other Hartnell stories as well, that I think permeates to the story, because later on in the story you have tales of Elakia murdering and pillaging. You have his harem. You have references to torture, and the threat to Barbara, and it's the cliffhanger to episode 3 particularly, and in some ways episode 2, the threat to Barbara is a sexual one, and that's almost unheard of in, never mind modern Doctor Who, frankly anything past the Hartnell era.
Yeah, look, I think it goes as far as it can for a kids show. Maybe even goes a little past where it can for a kids show. I mean, there are people getting stuck with arrows. There are people getting impaled on swords, all sorts of things. And you watch it and think, oh my God, this was a different time. But all of that said, it still doesn't acknowledge and delve down into some of the really nasty stuff that was going on, Dave. I mean, I swatted up a bit. I think you swatted up a bit more than me. But, after the siege of Acre, for example, Saladin refused to pay the ransom on the garrison that Richard had taken, and Richard flipped out and executed 3,000 Muslims in view of Saladin's army. And naturally Saladin said, well, anything you can do, I can do better. He pulled out all his Christians he had to hand and executed them. These guys were playing for keeps, but the more unsavoury stuff like that was going on doesn't make it into the story. So we go some of the way. We do have people being hit by arrows. Barbara is threatened sexually. There's a lot in there for a kid's show, but it doesn't quite go all the way. Even though it expects people to know this history, it doesn't touch on all of it.
Yeah, so I think that's absolutely correct, but I do want to highlight even just the scene where the father gives Barbara the dagger and says, if Elakia finds you, kill my daughter.
Yeah.
That's again something I couldn't imagine many other eras, if any other eras of the show, doing. But you're right. There's some other historical stuff I want to get into when we talk about the Saladin and his brethren later, but it's an interesting take on history because the people are correct. Richard was there. Saladin was there. Saffredin was there. Princess Joan, or Joanna as she's referred to here, what was there? The story of Richard wanting to marry his sister to Saffredin to try and cement this peace treaty, all these beats actually happened in this place.
The hunting party that goes wrong at the start.
Yeah.
that actually happened.
Yeah, and look, I've been to Jaffa, so I've been to Lod. I've been to the places where this was set. So these are real things that really happened, and the beats are correct. But as you say, it's a very sanitized. Terrence Dix would probably say, the schoolboy book of the Crusade. It's very sort of that, and I think that the weakness in that, as you identified, is this sanitized sort of Shakespearean language where they're all sort of wandering around shouting prose at each other and making lovely speeches and all in their finery and, we'll make war tomorrow and, it's all very nice and but sanitized version of history. On the other hand, I was watching this, particularly part 3, and some of those exchanges with Richard and Joanna, and listening to the dialogue and just going, wow, this is just beautiful dialogue. Some of the monologues that Saladin gets are just these beautiful, poetic pieces of dialogue that again reflect a form of television that still feels like a radio play or a stage play, and it's just gorgeous prose. I really felt my chest beating listening to it, and I was just smiling, going, we don't deserve this.
Yeah, it is a very well written piece. And again, as you mentioned at the start, that David Whittaker wrote this after he was script editor of Doctor Who. There was this weird transition period, Dave, where Dennis Spooner, who was his successor, was sort of trailing him around, and Whittaker had got special permission to write The Rescue and introduce Vicky and all of that sort of good stuff. But then as soon as he was officially off the production team, Spooner just turned around and said, mate, do you want to write another one? And that was going to be called The Saracen Hordes. It eventually became this.
Starting the famous tradition that outgoing script editors are immediately commissioned to write the next story by their successor.
Yeah, funny how that happens, isn't it? Yeah.
Look, we've touched on it, so let's dive a bit deeper. What's your view? Let's sort of start high level and then go down. What was your view on the portrayal of Salah ad-Din and the Saracens in this as the opposing force to the English Crusaders?
I think sympathetic is probably the wrong word, but it's certainly not anti-Muslim or just trying to big up Richard as being some sort of hero and Saladin as being this evil bloke. I think it's pretty fair and balanced. In saying that, I know that Richard and I think Saladin too are portrayed more in that old school romanticised version of what these guys were like. Maybe like, as you say, the boys' own, first book of the Crusades or whatever. Because there was some really nasty stuff going on. I mentioned some executions earlier. But I think Richard and Saladin both get treated the same, which for something made in the 60s, maybe it shouldn't surprise me, but it does surprise me.
Yeah, I felt the same. I always feel going into this that we're going to get the English with the goodies and the other side with the baddies.
Yeah.
And that's not what comes out here. I think the portrayals are interesting. Saladin is one of those interesting historical figures where there's always that sort of, that narrative and then the pushback and then the reassertion of the narrative, etc. But you look at contemporaneous writings of him or near contemporaneous writings about him, and certain themes are pretty consistent. Him being incredibly pious is something that's very consistent. Him being a very good tactician and a very good leader are very consistent. And a lot of European nobles in the centuries, or the century that came after Saladin died, did hold him up as being the model of a leader and a warlord. And that's the model of a leader and a warlord by the standards of the 12th and 13th century. So, he wasn't, anti-death penalty or, above torture or any of those sort of things. They would still do horrific things by our standards. He was still absolutely ruthless as a ruler in that part of the world in that time would be. But I think this attempt to portray him as wise and noble and honourable is a very good reflection of the sort of character he was, to the best that we can judge it, and based on contemporaneous things. In Victorian times, there was this very large romanticification of Saladin and Richard and the Crusades. And I think what you're sort of getting in the 1960s is the tail end of that very romantic thing. Where,
it's definitely there.
Yeah, where they are these two wise leaders shouting Shakespearean dialogue, at people and making the right decisions. Although Richard is shown to have a much bigger temper and be if anything, more flawed than Saladin. So I think that portrayal is very fair and realistic. Richard as well, I think there's been this sort of consistent through English history narrative of him being Coeur de Lion, Richard the Lionheart, and one of the great kings of England. Of course, his statue is the one outside Westminster Palace in London. And there's always that pushback of, well, he did mess up a few times and he had some very poor judgment sometimes. And yes, he absolutely neglected his role as King of England to sort of like, hey, John, you rule this country. I don't really care about it. I'm off to fight the Crusades. There is that pushback. And
yeah, it's portrayed that sort of popular opinion, like, oh, my brother is going to take over England. I must get back. I don't think he was very interested in England. I think he thought England was a bit of a cesspit.
Yeah, I think England was basically, how can I fund and fuel the things I really want to do in France and the Holy Land? Yeah. So there is a slightly more realistic portrayal of Richard I these days, but that idea of him being this English hero and of being a noble man and all the rest of it, I think has been pretty enduring and probably is very reflective again as well. Rob, we talk about the portrayal of the Saracens. I think that what's interesting is that just as we get King Richard, who's a good Englishman, and Joanna, who's a good English woman, and then you get the Chamberlain, who's sort of a bit of a buffer, and then you get the Earl of Leicester, who is a bit wicked and a bit manipulative. With the Saracen, you get Saladin, who's very wise and very noble, and Saphadin, who's a bit of a buffer, and the Ilakir, who is wicked and evil, and all the rest of it. So I think it's just saying, look, it doesn't matter what side of the racial spectrum or political spectrum or religious spectrum you're on, there are good guys and bad guys.
Yeah.
The blackface. Any thoughts there, Rob?
Oh, I made some notes on it.
Well, let's have them.
There's no getting around it. I'm going to call it brown face.
Okay.
In this episode. And Doctor Who fandom being what it is, you do get people wringing their hands about this and going a bit over the top about it. I mean, would it have been better if there'd been an abundance of brown-skinned actors in rep and in the inner circles of where these actors came from? Of course. But I think people who complain these days have this idea that these acting circles and maybe society itself was more multicultural like it is today. And it just wasn't. You see some of these repertory companies, they're all white. And they'd get in people of colour when they could. I mean, Cleo Silvestre, who passed away just recently, I think this past week, is in the Crusade, Dave. So it's not like they were, oh no, we're not going to hire people of colour, because they absolutely did hire people of colour. They'd just augment it with actors in brownface. And to be honest, I see it as a desire for them to be doing it, as far as they're concerned, accurately. And without any irony, they're respecting the topic and its subjects by doing it this way. So I think the brownface is very much of its time. And the litmus test for me is that it's not being done for humour. It's not being done to belittle people from that part of the world. The desire is to represent these characters in a serious way. And for me, that trumps a general, oh, well, we wouldn't do that today. Of course we wouldn't do it today. But for back then, I give it a pass. Yeah,
I think it's been given a pass a bit more generally by fandom as well. I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One, people don't see it as often. Two, it's in black and white. So brownface in black and white isn't nearly as overt as it is when you're doing it in colour. Although now that we've got Blu-ray quality, I mean, I think it was always pretty clear on Bernard Kay playing Saladin, but I now look at it and you can see it on some of the other characters as well. So, it was there, but I think it's also because they do portray Saladin as such a noble and respected figure, and also the fact that, as you say, Bernard Kay isn't trying to do some sort of terrible cod Arabic accent or performance.
No.
He's doing a very Shakespearean, today, my brother, we will treat them well. It's very serious, very Shakespearean, and I don't think there was any motivation other than, hey, these guys are from Arabia. They should have darker skin. Makeup, So yeah, you wouldn't do it today, but
it's like how Othello had been done.
Yeah.
For all time up until that point.
Which, like we discussed with our episode on Curse of the Daleks last month, there is stuff that does occasionally make you go, ooh, wouldn't do that now. But as a time capsule of what the attitudes were. I find that sort of stuff fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely.
Rob, I forgot until I watched this again. This was directed by Dougie Camfield.
Yeah, when his name came up earlier in the show, I was going to throw in, we'll be talking about Dougie later, I'm sure, but I didn't get a chance to mention it. But yes, Douglas Camfield directed this and did a very bloody good job, I think.
It's really, really interesting to watch a director like him at work on a story like this, because he really goes to quite a bit of effort to make sure that when we've just got a scene that's 2, maybe 3 people just talking at each other, he really does get the actors and actresses to move around each other. Particularly the way that Jean Marsh is very, very sort of darty in the way that she moves around. Richard is very calm. Richard sort of can quietly, almost sort of subtly slide into a scene, and then he'll slide somewhere else. And then he'll get angry and he'll jump, and then he'll slide back. Whereas Joanna is very flitty and very sort of, she's darting all over the place. So there's that really good thing. But he cuts the camera really quickly between pieces of dialogue. And there's a couple of moments where you can see the vision mixer wasn't quite on there, and he's just a half a beat away, and that's just a reflection of, I think, how fast Camfield was doing this. But even the fight scenes, which we know Camfield is sort of known for, where they cut away to what I think must be a separate filmed insert in part 1, with a really properly choreographed fight scene, it's quite impressive.
Yeah, and I've made a note here that Dougie, for his part, really loved the script, and the story runs that he didn't change a line of dialogue in it. But at the same time, another legend has it that Hartnell felt there were some lines in it which implied an incestuous relationship between Richard and Joanna, and that offending material was removed. So the script was changed, according to that version of history. But aware of Whittaker's original intentions, however, I have also seen a third story that Julian Glover and Jean Marsh were still keen to run with the incest idea through just their performance with each other. Even if they couldn't say the lines, they were trying to put it in there, and apparently Verity Lambert took them aside and said, "Don't think I don't know what you're doing."
Yeah, that's interesting. It's interesting when you hear these different sort of conflicting stories, but again, talking about the centuries-long narrative of Richard I, there has always also been that sort of sense that his sexual power wasn't necessarily quite as wholesome as we may want to think. Now, whether it's, rumours about him having incestuous relationships, or rumours about him having homosexual relationships with the King of France, for example, there's always sort of been these little lines that go through. And I know, when I read books about Richard, modern historians just sort of go, we don't know. We don't know whether this is our interpretation, whether people are trying to spin stuff, whether it's legend going over the top, or whether it's fact. We just don't know, but that's interesting. But to get back to Camfield, I think his direction is really, really good. But also what struck me, even in that first 5 minutes, is the production of this thing, where you've got them walking in a wood. And look, as a fan watching it, knowing how television was made in that time and analysing for a podcast, I can sort of see the edges of the studio and see just how small this wood is. But Camfield is really clever in the way that he does make the wood seem like it's much, much denser, much, much deeper than it is. And even though the TARDIS must be literally about 1.5 meters just off screen, they make it feel like it's a bit further away. But even something little like getting an actual hawk onto the set, a lot of directors wouldn't have bothered to do that. And just that little detail, when it's the first scene in a story and you see an actual hawk, you go, oh, wow, they're making some effort on this one.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. I'll just say one thing about the wood. I listened this time around, as well as watching the couple of episodes on the Lost in Time DVD. I listened to the BBC audio where it's the episodes with William Russell, narrating here and there. And at the end of that, there's an interview with William Russell. And they talk to him about how he was stationed in World War II in this part of the world. And he says, yes, I was stationed sort of in Jaffa. And he said, I don't recall any forests like that. There was sort of scrub here and there. I don't recall actual forests like that. So that might be a bit of an embellishment.
Yeah, we're not quite sure how far outside Jaffa they were. And given that basically all the area now between the two areas where this is set, so basically between Jaffa and Elakir's palace, whatever it was. Basically, they're the two sides of Tel Aviv. So what is now Tel Aviv is now in the middle of that. So, I mean, I can't judge. When I was there was Tel Aviv. So, I can't really judge. But yeah, look, the production's superb. The performances I just think we need to highlight. And I want to start with Hartnell because, look, everybody knows I'm a Hartnell fan. But this is another of those performances where you look at him and you go, this was an actor in command of his craft. And when he was on, he was on. And the way that he has the Doctor portraying confidence when he needs to, but you can tell privately the Doctor's quite worried that he can shirt front the Earl of Leicester and stare down the King of England, but then a moment later be sort of like, I'm not quite sure how this is going to work out and I'm a little bit nervous. Just the way he balances that is, I think, incredibly doctorish and really, really good.
Yeah, on the Doctor, I think he's pretty twinkly throughout all of this.
Yeah.
And we often say this, but anyone who watches Twice Upon a Time and thinks they know the Hartnell Doctor needs to watch a story like this. He giggles like bloody Yoda most of the time. He finds shoplifting the clothes for himself and Vicky particularly funny. He thinks it's hilarious. Yes. And speaking of Vicky, he has a super relationship with her in this, like he does in all the stories she's in. And good afternoon, it's just brilliant.
Good afternoon.
He's fantastic.
Yeah, I absolutely love that first Dr. Vicky relationship. It's really good. Ian and Barbara, Rob, any thoughts?
Yeah, Ian gets to be the super action man in this, which is par for the course in a lot of his stories. Of course, you have to park your disbelief that a science teacher can just pick up a sword and hold off a Saracen.
He did national service, Rob. They taught crusading in national service.
Oh, right, okay, yeah. So this Saracen who's probably held a sword since he was old enough to lift it up. You just got to go with it. Getting knighted by Richard is cool.
Yes.
I think that's great. The mission to find Barbara is a good one. The scene where he's pegged out in the desert and almost eaten by ants is particularly adult for a kid's show.
Yeah.
And Barbara, yeah, she has a few whimpering moments when she's in real peril, and who can blame her for that? But on the whole, she's pretty tough in this, and she uses her brain. I really like the scene where she starts talking about recently being in ancient Rome and having visited a world run by insects. And the response is, you're an actor, you're a player, I think. I think that's a really clever bit of dialogue, and it's a great performance from Jacqueline Hill.
Yeah, I love the line where she's brought before Salah ad-Din by Elakir, and Elakir's talking about, I can do this to her, and I'll do this to her. And Salah ad-Din says, what do you think of that? And she just pauses for a moment and says, it sounds like the punishment for a fool.
Yeah.
And that's just a real sort of, I now would say that's a girl boss moment. But it's just a really strong moment where you go, look, again, she's allowed to be terrified. If I was there, I would be terrified. But she's still got her wits and her dignity. And I think that's what makes her a strong character.
Yeah. How about Vicky?
Look, she hasn't got as much to do in this as she has in other stories, but again, she's just fun. She's enjoying herself. She clearly loves travelling with the Doctor, which is always lovely to see. But more than anything, you said it before, Rob, just that relationship between the first Doctor and Vicky is so warm and tender, and a proper mentor Telemachus relationship. It's just so lovely.
Yeah, I like how Vicky's paired up with the Doctor here, and we do the whole charade of her being a boy. It's not super convincing, though. I mean, she doesn't do much with her hair, and her breasts are there for all to see. But again, like Ian and his sword play, it's just something you've got to accept and move on with. It's part of the story. Just go with it.
Yeah, and, it's very sort of, English pantomime, traditional Shakespeare, yes. All that sort of stuff.
Absolutely. There is an odd line from her about being afraid the Doctor's going to leave her, which seems to come out of nowhere as they're having such a top time together, and you think, well, why would you think that? I mean, I guess it can be read as, we're having such a top time together, don't ever leave me because I'm enjoying this. But the way it comes across, it seems very needy and kind of comes from nowhere.
I think, given that Whittaker wrote The Rescue, which is also brilliant, by the way, but The Rescue is all about Vicky having lost everything and basically only being saved by going on with the Doctor. I think what Whittaker is trying to do there is remind us all that Vicky is an orphan, that she's lost her parents, that she's lost everything else, and that she's really only got the Doctor. You're right, the dialogue doesn't quite come through that way. I think it's one moment where Whittaker's writing is quite clumsy, but I think that's what he was going for.
I've also made a note that this one, now that we're talking about the actors involved, this one is quite the Doctor Who family episode. Obviously, Julian Glover was cast as Richard, but at one stage Nicholas Courtney was considered for the role. And of course, Courtney would become the Brigadier when Dougie Camfield, who was directing this, hired him for Web of Fear. Joanna's played by Jean Marsh, whose first husband was John Pertwee.
Yes.
And Marsh becomes Sarah Kingdom in the Daleks Master Plan, also through the Camfield connection. And the cherry on top, Dave, another candidate for Joanna was Adrian Hill, who would soon get cast in The Mythmakers as Katarina. So this is just like Doctor Who family, just written all over it.
And of course, Bernard Kay, who would go on to be on many more Doctor Who's over the course of his time. Look, I don't want to go through each one, but I just want to say, I sent a photo of the TV to a friend of mine at work and said, hey, I'm watching the show from 1966, and Julian Glover and Jean Marsh are both in it, and they were both actors and actresses that he recognised and went, oh, wow, I know those people. And, that's just... It's just such a good cast. It's just an amazing cast and saying amazing dialogue, and that's just really cool.
Yeah. Now, Dave, I'll just mention briefly, because I think we touched on this earlier, I find it interesting that the story doesn't really have an ending. Of course it ends, but after a bit of a nothing burger in the middle episodes, our heroes just sort of bugger off. And it's really down to the audience again, knowing what happened in the Crusades and how the Doctor's prophecy for Richard will come true, but maybe only from a certain point of view, to rip off Obi-Wan Kenobi, that sort of gives it any real ending. And even that's something that happens off screen. And again, only if you know the story, it sort of happens in your head. It's a strange ending in some ways.
Yeah, I was definitely quite struck that we actually finish Richard's plot about halfway through part 4.
Yeah.
That was really interesting. And so, yeah, you're right. It really is just about trying to escape from the various plots and getting to the TARDIS, because it is an adventure story. There is that one final hurdle that they've got to get past to get to the TARDIS, make sure we have an exciting finish. But you're right. I mean, there isn't really a plot narrative through this. There isn't, well, we arrived, we had to do this, we had to achieve that. It's just, we arrived, Barbara was kidnapped, so we just need to all survive as long as we can to get Barbara back and then all go home.
Yeah, it's really interesting with pure historicals how the TARDIS crew literally can't change history, so we're just presented with real events. As we mentioned earlier, the attempt to marry off Joanna was real, that hunting party getting attacked by the Saracens was real, and a bloke pretended to be Richard, and got captured. All of that was real. And the crew just has to survive and then beat a retreat. That's it.
That's absolutely right. And look, the final thing I want to talk about is what they have to survive against, and that is Elakir. And a point that I've made a few times over the years is that I think one of the things that really separates successful Hartnell historicals from the less successful ones is the quality of the villain. So you think about the Aztecs, which is I think is correctly held up as the pinnacle of the Hartnell historicals by most fans.
Yeah.
That is really hinging off the portrayal of Totoxel. And again, just as a side note, when we go back and see the Aztecs, there are good Aztecs and bad Aztecs. They're a complicated, society. Marco Polo, which is my favourite of the Hartnell historicals, you have Tegana, who is a great villain and sort of works his wickedness all the way through that, compared to something like the Reign of Terror, where, okay, there's sort of, a couple of obstacle-type baddies who sort of pop in for an episode to, arrest somebody and then disappear, or Robespierre, who's sort of a baddie, but over there... there isn't a sort of a baddie. Even the Romans, which is very funny and very witty, there isn't really a baddie in the Romans.
Yeah.
Whereas here you've got Elakir. What did you think of him?
Yeah, I think he's what's needed to give this story, such as it is. I mean, I mentioned a moment ago that, the middle of it's a bit of a big nothing burger. It needs a bit of a kick, and he is the character bringing it, really. Otherwise, it is maybe just Richard throwing out Shakespearean lines and... and Saladin throwing out Shakespearean lines and a bit of history thrown in, and there's not much to it.
Yeah, but in classic sort of henchman styling, very quickly it's shown that Saladin thinks Elakir is a bit of a fool, and he's like, you bugger off out of my court, I don't want to talk to you. And so he just goes off and does bad things off in his own little sort of palace, a few miles down the road. I think that separation isn't something I'd really understood and appreciated before, but that was really cool. But yeah, look, as a villain, I think he works. I don't think he's quite Totoxel and Tegana, but he's up there.
Yeah.
No, before we finish up, Rob, I just want to mention the Recon. I watched the Blu-ray version. I thought the recons were very good. The way they used the photographs and the syncing of them was very good. And it did allow me to just sort of watch the story through as a 4-parter without really having to be distracted. The only disadvantage is that there were moments when I think some level of either narration or action subtitles would have been useful. The end of part 2 is about 3 minutes of Barbara basically evading people through the village. And on audio, that just doesn't work. The way that Elakia is killed is it's not weird, but the way the telesnaps are done, there isn't the telesnap at the right moment. There's a telesnap of Elakia. There's a sort of a blurred snap of him falling down, but there isn't the telesnap of him actually seeing who's stabbing him and who's killing him. So I was like, I think it was the father guy, but I did actually have to go back and check the storyline and go, yes, it was. So
it's the 60s version of Caves of Androzani, the Australian edit.
Yes, a little bit like that. So look, they were by far a very effective way of watching this, but just a couple of little minor irrits from me. How did you do parts 2 and 4?
I did the BBC audio, which was just taking the episode audio with William Russell narrating. And then I just watched the 2 episodes that exist. So I didn't actually go to the Blu-rays. I didn't think to do it, actually.
Oh, fair enough. Well, that would have been really interesting. Rob, we've talked about the Crusade. Final thought?
Look, I mentioned it's really interesting with pure historicals, how the TARDIS crew can't change history. I think this can be a good and a bad thing. It's good because it's realistic to maybe what time travel would really be like. And it's bad because there's sometimes not much of a story to hand outside what feels like a bit of a tarted up Encyclopedia Britannica entry. But working within this constraint, I think the Crusade still works well. And it doesn't do anything too wrong or too egregious. I think it works and it looks really good. I think if it existed in full, it would be extremely well regarded. I don't think people would call it an outright classic, but I think they'd regard it very, very highly. But that's a fantasy, I guess, because as it stands, it's in pieces and it involves a bit of history that I don't think a lot of people around the world, even in the UK now, may know very well without going out of their way to study it. I'm not sure it even interests people enough to drag them into even starting down the path of appreciating it by watching what's there and reading up on some history. So I'm really glad the listeners voted for it, as I said earlier, and that we've been able to look at it tonight, because maybe some folk out there will hear us enthuse about it and at least give it a try, because there's something good there. Yeah,
I echo all of that. I'm really glad that the listeners voted for this. I've really enjoyed watching and listening to it. I agree, is it as good as the Aztecs or Marco Polo? No, but it's a near miss. It's just a not quite as good. When the performances and the dialogue is hitting, it is absolutely hitting. Is it for everybody? The answer to that is clearly no. If you find the Hartnell stories too slow, if you are not a fan of dialogue-heavy sort of stories, then this isn't going to be for you. It is a very dialogue-heavy one. Now, I revel in that dialogue, and I revel in those performances, and I revel in the history. So this absolutely just lands for me. I accept that it's not going to land for everybody, but as a less well-known story, and now that it's out on the Season 2 Blu-ray, if you have skipped over it because you think it's missing or it's not one of the better regarded ones, do check it out. And I think you're right, Rob. If this was existing, it would be better known, it would be better regarded. And I think particularly if episode 4 existed and had a finish, it would help it. But I've loved watching this. It was just, you know what, Rob? I'm a Doctor Who fan. I like this show, and I enjoyed watching it, and that's a good thing.
Me too.
Fantastic. We've spoken for nearly as long as the Crusade went for about the Crusade, so we'll move on to listener feedback. Rob, do you want to kick us off with Dylan Mooney?
I can do. This is Dylan Mooney commenting on our top historical settings episode of The Listmakers, and he's writing to us via YouTube. He says, I can't agree more about Ireland. As an Irish fan, I can't really believe it hasn't happened in the show proper at some stage. The Book of Kells McGann audio is the closest it got. At least Sydney appeared on screen in the pilot via CGI, yet no Ireland. It's surprising. Lady Jane Grey was done quite well in the Sarah Jane Adventures, and it's still a good idea, though, for the main show.
That's a good point. I do need to watch that Lady Jane one. I must do that. Thank you, Dylan. Yeah, no, I agree. From first-time correspondent Kenny Logan via email. Hi guys, my name is Kenny Logan from Bonnie, Scotland, and I have been a long-time listener now for over 6 years and absolutely love your show. Well, thank you, Kenny. I love your country. Beautiful.
And the accents.
And the accents.
And the driving roads.
Oh my God, the driving in
and the
Scotland.
scotch.
So much to love.
I'll shut up.
I'm retiring to Scotland one of these days, I'm sure. Kenny goes on to say, I just wanted to make a top 5 suggestion for your show. My question is, what are your own personal top 5 pieces of Doctor Who memorabilia that you own? Thanks for all the great discussions and shows that you bring us every month. They always brighten my days when I'm out walking my dog.
Oh, that's an interesting one.
That is going in the head of wrestling. So thank you, Kenny, for listening and for writing.
I can think of 2 off the top of my head.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Alrighty, moving on. We've got Dave Young via email. He says, Hi, Rob and Dave. Long time since I made contact from here in the UK. Too busy enjoying my retirement and the very rare British sunshine. Just had a few thoughts about historical settings after your latest Listmakers episode, which also include a couple of very interesting characters, which I think fit perfectly into the mystery of Who. Firstly, the early 19th century in Germany and the mysterious story of Caspar Hauser, the strange boy with the even stranger story, who appeared one day in the streets of Nuremberg. There are a number of theories as to who he may have been, eventually murdered, though some claim this was a self-inflicted wound that went wrong, ranging from a crown prince of Europe who had been hidden away for some reason, or at the other end of the spectrum, a con artist. Where did he come from? Something the Doctor would have fun discovering. Secondly, Europe in the 18th century and Count Saint-Germain, a mysterious nobleman who had knowledge in alchemy, philosophy and science. Nobody ever knew where he came from, but he was seen over a great number of years and never seemed to age. Regeneration, perhaps? Could even be the Doctor posing as the Count for some reason. Thirdly, the 1480s, and the story of Richard III and the princes in the Tower, perhaps showing that Richard was not the villain he's regularly portrayed as, and, as now being researched, did the princes survive and indeed escape? Could the Doctor have been behind this? The BBC could do a great medieval adventure, and as Rob mentioned, we have lots of great castles to film in. Finally, the Titanic in 1912. I know we had a picture in Rose of the 9th Doctor saving a family from boarding, but what if it was more than an iceberg that led to the disaster? Ice Warriors? Still loving the show. Keep up the good work.
That's some great suggestions there, Dave, and I'm particularly interested in the 15th century one, given that I'm now 1 week into a 10-week course via Oxford Online into the Wars of the Roses, so
nice.
Definitely twinkles my fancy there. From Stephen Moffat via email. Dear Rob and Dave, thank you both very much for all of the effort that goes into producing and presenting the Doctor Who Show podcast. I love the show and look forward to each episode. The range of topics you cover is always interesting. The current and classic shows, the books, fandom, God help you, and recently even a stage show from the 60s. It's always fresh. I think the format's cool too. Love the list making and occasional snaps. The summer special, the sports desk, and the gin-fueled reviews. Mostly, though, I love the attitude. There's an openness and directness about the topics, but it's always underpinned by a real love and regard for Doctor Who. That's a lovely balance, especially now as people seem increasingly to pick sides with regard to Doctor Who's production, cast, storytelling, etc. Something you were saying earlier, Rob.
Yeah.
I really appreciate the moderate, thoughtful, and positive tone of the Doctor Who Show podcast. I think I realised I'd found my Doctor Who podcast in an episode where Dave was askance at the Briggs meteoric promotion from an NCO. Never going to happen. In the same week, I'd nearly sent back some unit action figures I'd bought who were supplied with an SA-80 derivative rifles instead of FN-FAL SLR derived ones. I'm still quietly fuming. I usually listen over a couple of quiet jars at my local after work on a Thursday, and regularly, usually when the Doctor's been crying again or the Chibnall era comes up, look around the bar in sympathy with Rob for someone to hold my beer. Anyways, please keep up the great work. Really appreciate it. From Stephen Moffat.
That's fantastic, and it's not that Stephen Moffat as he mentioned to us offline.
No, really lovely to hear that. Thank you, Stephen.
Yeah. Now we have Neil C, regular correspondent for the show, via email. Oi, gents, how are you? So I've taken a random notion and have just been binging through the Davison era in no particular order. And it got me thinking, why do so many people often say the Fifth Doctor is vanilla, etc.? I don't get it. I've always liked the Fifth Doctor and Davison's portrayal of him, and I don't think people realise the Fifth Doctor is extremely witty. Oh, I realise it. Some of his one-liners are brilliant. Granted, I think not mixing the costume up every so often was a mistake, and that's the same with all the characters. I don't get why in season 19 none of them changed their clothes, and Turlough was always wearing a school uniform, bar Planet of Fire. But back to the Doctor himself. He's caring and kind, and yes, he's vulnerable on occasions, but I don't think that's a bad thing. Davison had to go down a completely different route to his predecessors. Like I've already mentioned, he is extremely witty. In fact, you could argue the wittiest of all the Doctors. There's a nice level of emotion from Davison. It's not overboard like Tennant at times, or more recently Gatwa. Don't get me started on the crying again. Davison's emotion is subtle. Regards the era itself, yes, there are some drags. I include Snake Dance in this. I know some love it, but for me, I was a tad bored.
Here.
Another is Castrovalva. I think it's a bit dull at times. But I never really look at the Davison era and think there's loads of weak stories. People will point at Time Flight, but to be honest, I don't think it's that bad. It's the effects that let it down. It's not great, but it's by no means the worst Doctor Who story ever. Think of the classics that are in this run: The Five Doctors, Caves of Androzani, Earthshock, The Visitation, to name but a few. And there's loads of underrated stories, such as Planet of Fire and Resurrection of the Daleks.
Yes.
The latter is a belter, by the way. I love that it's a bloodbath and has a very sad ending with great incidental music, and I don't care what anyone says. I love Warriors of the Deep, nostalgia from childhood, and I will defend it to the death. Yes, it's very 80s and the Merca is ridiculous, but I don't care. There's also some epic musical scores as well. Yes, there's some jarring ones too, but the music on the 50th anniversary soundtrack collection just highlights how good the Davison era music generally is. I know you'll love this, Rob, as you're a big Davo fan, a very underrated Doctor and one that deserves more love and respect. Here's a listmaker suggestion. If you haven't already done it, your top 5 Davison era stories. As always, keep up the great work, guys. Oh, and isn't it great that they're finally bringing out Blake 7 on Blu-ray? I love it.
Thank you very much for that, Neilers. I absolutely am looking forward to the Blake 7 Blu-rays. That's going to be very cool. Look, I agree with a lot of what Neil has said. I think that I'm always a bit surprised when I think of just how many brilliant stories there are in the Davison era. But I also think, and Rob, I won't like this as I've said it before, but I think the worst costume decision ever made in Doctor Who was not Colin's jacket, it was Peter Davison's. Because I think that very bland beige costume does permeate some of his character and his story, or at least the way he's perceived, and I think that does hide some of the very good performance that Davison's giving.
Yeah, which is something I touched on in that YouTube video I made last year or the year before, whenever I made it.
Yes.
Did the Fifth Doctor wear a cricket outfit? And in that, I've got a lot of background on other alternatives, particularly June Hudson doing this sort of Brideshead Revisited look for Davo. And he would have looked superb in it. And J&T just overruled it. Oh, my God. But Neilers, I loved reading that email. Yes, I did enjoy that. Any big love for Davo is all right by me.
Thank you again to everybody who wrote in. We're getting towards the end of our story. A quick what have we been watching? I'll say I've watched the new series of That 90s Show. I'm not a big sitcom fan, but I really enjoyed that. Certainly helped by the fact that Kevin Smith and Jason Mewes rocked up in a couple of episodes. I will say, though, that in the same way that 70s Show was always good comedy, but occasionally forgot that it was set in the 70s, I think That 90s Show was very fun. But there are a few episodes where I've gone, there was nothing 90s about that, and that's a shame. I watched the very final episode of the Grand Tour, which of course is from the Top Gear threesome. I thought this was a fantastic finale. It just had an epic road trip, spectacular countryside. It was funny, it was entertaining. When they went off on their weird tangents, it wasn't too ridiculous. And then the actual final moments were done properly. It wasn't overly melodramatic, it wasn't overly indulgent, but there were just a few quiet moments. The soundtrack was good, the visuals were spectacular, and I thought that was a perfect ending to those three guys making just fantastic television that I really enjoyed. And I've watched the first 2 episodes of Agatha All Along, which is the Disney Plus Marvel MCU sequel to WandaVision. The first 2 episodes were really good. I thought there was good mystery, good sense of fun, good sense of whimsy. They won't be everybody's cup of tea, but they seem to be getting good reviews. Twitter reviews have been basically been good. 80% both fan and critic on Rotten Tomatoes, which, Rob, as you said to me, sort of proves that where some of these Disney Plus series, whether it's Star Wars, MCU, have tanked in the feedback, it's not just because everybody's cynical these days. Good shows like this are being rewarded, so maybe the bad ones just weren't that popular.
It's the only way to look at it, because people are out there saying, oh, these haters on YouTube, they hate this stuff, and then everyone doesn't want to watch the show, and, they ruin everything. But no, there are YouTubers out there saying, Agatha all along is probably not for us, and we don't particularly like the look of it. They're saying all of that, but it's not affecting the audience scores. So, no, they don't materially affect the audience scores if the audience is interested in the show. It's just common sense.
No, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with saying, this is a fine show, it's not for me.
Yeah, that too.
What about yourself, Rob?
I'm continuing to blast through Young Indiana Jones. At this moment in time, I'm down to the last 4 movies out of 22. So
wow.
I've watched 18 hour-and-a-half long Young Indiana Jones movies in recent times. And I've been having a good time with most of it. I've also been writing an essay on each one after I've been watching it, so just putting my thoughts down. Like you, Dave, I watched the Grand Tour finale. I thought it was very good. Even when it did get manipulative at the end, having them walking and acting in the ways they'd done 20 years earlier and sort of flicking between the two, and the soundtrack would make this ominous sort of sound as they flicked between Richard Hammond touching a rock 20 years ago, and then he touched the rock, in 2023 or whenever they filmed it. It almost got me, but it felt a bit too confected. I think it would have worked better if it was in a movie, like in, say, Alexander, when he's going to ride Bucephalus one last time against the Indian war elephants down in India, and it cuts back to him as a boy talking to Bucephalus, and the dialogue gets intertwined between him as a boy and him as a man talking to the same horse. That gets me as a story because it's a fantasy, but when it's a real life thing happening in a TV show, you just know they've gone on location and gone, okay, now Hammond, you have to put the right arm out, Hammond, and touch the rock in a certain way. And it just felt a little bit too confected, so I couldn't go with it. But overall, I really liked the special. I thought it was great.
Great.
And finally, Fatherhood with My Father, which is Jack Whitehall and his father. I've loved their shtick across several series that they've done in the past, but this one with Jack Whitehall preparing for fatherhood, I did an episode with my wife, and we looked at each other at the end and were like, yeah, no, we don't need any more of this. And so we gave up on that one. And that's probably the most recent thing I've tried to watch.
Fair enough. Rob, we've covered a lot tonight.
Yes.
It feels like the start of the show was a long time ago. It's only been an hour and a half, though, our usual length, but that's cool. Hopefully, listeners, you've enjoyed it. Hopefully, you got something out of it. But next time, we are going to do a deep dive into a season. We haven't done one of those for a couple of episodes. We have agreed, once again, we'll put it up as a listener poll, so do check out our Twitter feed a couple of days after this goes out. We've agreed we're going to nominate each a classic and a new season of Doctor Who. Rob, what's the classic season you're nominating?
Season 24, Dave.
Season 24. Interesting. I'm going to go season 9.
Okay. Ooh, some pert.
And your new series?
I'm going with the 2013 specials, comprising Day of the Doctor and Time of the Doctor.
I'm going to go with series 3.
Okay. Yeah, great.
So, 9, 24, 3, and the 2013 specials.
Yeah.
Well, we've talked for plenty of time. I've enjoyed it, Rob. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope the listeners have enjoyed it.
Yeah, me too. Let us know if you did.
Absolutely. We'll be back over the next month with our usual stuff. We're expecting a Jin and TARDIS in there. Definitely List Makers. Possibly Alternate Galaxies if I can watch Fellowship of the Ring in the next couple of weeks, which I plan to. It is a very long movie, though, so, got to put off an entire weekend to get through that.
I'm letting you watch the baby one, Dave.
You are. So, look, hopefully that'll all come over the next few weeks. But until then, I've been Dave.
I've been Rob.
And we'll speak again soon.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
You've been listening to
The Doctor Who Show with Rob and Dave.
Find us online by searching for
The Doctor Who Show.
We also love it when you write in. Drop us a line anytime at hello@thedwshow.net.
Good afternoon.